Alright, in this lesson you're going to learn about the number of the different subatomic particles. Please make sure you take notes on the items in yellow as you're watching the movie. Definitely write questions down in the margin as you're watching the movie as well. You've already learned about how to read the basics of the periodic table. So if you learned that the whole number on the periodic table is the atomic number. You've got the chemical symbol that helps basically abbreviate the name. It's either a single capital letter or a capital letter with either one or, in rare cases, two lowercase letters after it. And then you also have something called the average atomic mass, which we'll make sure we understand, you'll understand by the end of this lesson. In the structure of the atom lesson, you learned how the atom actually is. That you've got in the center of the atom the two most massive particles in the atom, which are the protons and the neutrons. The protons, again, are positively charged, and the neutrons basically act as glue. Remember, like charges will want to repel, so the two protons which both have positive charges will try to push each other apart. The neutrons basically act to glue that together to make the inside of the atom stable. Outside of that, you've got the electrons that are moving around a cloud outside of the nucleus. As you learned in the atomic structure lesson, the nucleus is very, very tiny, and the electron cloud is huge on the outside of that atom. Most of the atom is empty space. If you were to think of a marble being the nucleus, then the electrons would be whizzing around like the outside of Qualcomm Stadium, the upper deck seats basically, if the nucleus of that atom was at the center of the field on Qualcomm Stadium. Most of the atom's empty space with the electrons just whizzing through that empty space in their orbitals. It turns out that the periodic table tells us a lot more than just the name, the symbol, and the atomic number. It tells us about the subatomic particles. The first and most important thing that it tells us is the number of protons. The atomic number of an element is the number of protons. So since carbon has atomic number 6, it has 6 protons. Sodium has atomic number 13, it has 13 protons. All atoms of the same element have the same number of protons. So every single carbon atom is going to have 6 protons. And if an atom has 13 protons, and only 13 protons, it's got to be a sodium atom. So that's probably one of the most important things, but we can take that information and we know about the subatomic particles and know even more. First, let's make sure we understand that. If we look at beryllium, how many protons does a beryllium Be atom have? And then how many protons does a magnesium atom have? Mg. If you said 4 and 12, you'd be correct. Beryllium has atomic number 4, so it's got 4 protons. Magnesium has atomic number 12, so it's got 12 protons. Electrons are outside of the nucleus whizzing around. Those are the negatively charged particles that J.J. Thomson found. Those actually can change in an atom. Remember, J.J. Thomson found that electrons can actually get transferred from atom to atom. So while most atoms are neutral in the world around us, meaning the number of positive and negative charges are equal, they don't have to be. So a chlorine atom that has 17 protons can actually gain a chlorine atom that has 17 protons will usually have 17 electrons. But it can gain an extra electron, which actually makes the chlorine atom a little more stable, and then it has still 17 protons, because the number of protons can't change, but now it has 18 electrons, and so it would have a negative charge. Sodium atom can do a similar thing. It's atomic number 11, so it's going to have 11 protons. Usually it'll have 11 electrons, meaning positive and negative charges balance out. It's neutral. But it can lose one of those electrons, so it only has 10, and now it would have a positive charge. So the number of electrons can vary in one type of atom. The way you should remember it is electrons will equal the number of protons if the atom is neutral. And most substances in nature are neutral. If they're not neutral, somebody needs to tell you it's got a positive charge or it's got a negative charge for you to figure out what's going on with the number of electrons. The next thing, which is probably the hardest thing to understand and figure out, is the number of neutrons. Again, the neutrons act just to glue that nucleus together. So protons will always be the same. Electrons will sometimes can gain or lose them. Neutrons don't have to be the same. And different atoms, different atoms of one type can have different numbers of neutrons. What you call that is an isotope. So an isotope is an atom that has a different number of neutrons. Here's two examples of two different carbon isotopes, is what you would call them. You have carbon here that has, a carbon atom will always have 12 protons. Excuse me. A carbon atom will always have 6 protons, but in this first case it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons to glue it together. And in the second case it's got still just the 6 protons, but it's got 8 neutrons to glue it together. Those are going to be two different isotopes of carbon. They will, since it's the protons and the electrons that really control how something's going to react, they're going to react basically the same, except if you have really sensitive equipment to measure some what's called isotope chemistry, which you'll learn about in high school or college. You can study some interesting things, but the basic reactivity that you would see in the lab is going to be the same for all the isotopes of that element. Here's some examples again. Hydrogen has 1 proton in all cases, but it can have 3 different isotopes. The first type of isotope of hydrogen, which is most common, doesn't have any neutrons. The second type of isotope of hydrogen actually has 1 neutron, and the third type of isotope of hydrogen has 2 neutrons and still only 1 proton. Carbon has 3 different natural occurring isotopes, all of them with 6 protons, but it has one that has 6 neutrons, the most common, one that has 7 neutrons, and then one actually that has 8 neutrons, which is actually a radioactive form of carbon. We'll talk more about radioactivity later. You can figure out what's called the mass number by adding the 2 most massive parts of the atom together. So protons plus neutrons is going to equal the mass number. You can always figure out the number of protons just by using the atomic number on the periodic table, but someone's either going to have to give you the number of neutrons or they're going to have to give you the mass number for a particular isotope. If they give you the number of neutrons, you can figure out the mass number. If they instead give you the mass number, you can take the mass number and subtract the number of protons to find the number of neutrons. So you should be able to find either number of neutrons or the mass number as long as they give you the other value that you need to do the calculation. The average atomic mass is the last thing on the periodic table, and that's the average of all the natural occurring isotopes. So when we talked about carbon, for example, there's isotope that has a mass number of 12, 6 protons and 6 neutrons, mass number of 13, 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and mass number of 14, 6 protons and 8 neutrons. The average atomic mass is the average mass of all of those natural occurring isotopes. And for carbon, it's 12.01. Almost all carbon atoms are carbon-12 atoms with 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But the 2 other types of isotopes do exist, and they can tell us some interesting things about the world around us. That's it for understanding what the periodic table tells us about the subatomic particles of an atom. Definitely write down if you have any questions. Thank you.